This is Colin O'Keefe here for LXBN TV. Odds are you've either heard or seen your fair share of stories about incidents where the fear around Ebola may be a bit overblown. But did you know that there are people in the United States who have been terminated from their jobs out of concern for Ebola? Well, my guest today on LXBN TV says he is getting calls about exactly that. My guest is attorney Christopher McKinney of the McKinney firm in San Antonio and author on the Texas Employment Law Blog. Chris, you wrote that you've been receiving calls from people who have either been terminated or fear being terminated over Ebola concerns. Is this really happening? And what's your experience been with it? What are you hearing?
Sure, thanks, Colin. Yeah, it is really happening, and I'm as surprised as everyone else, quite frankly. The Ebola scare has been, everyone's talking about it, certainly in mainstream media. That's all that we're seeing there. And apparently fear is getting the best of us in some cases. And we've gotten calls from more than one employee who has been terminated for no apparent reason following a recent trip to Africa. And other things, obviously we can't talk about details of any particular case, but other things that go on in those cases lead us to believe that the reason that the employees have been terminated is out of fear on the part of the employer that they've been in an area of Africa where they might have been exposed to the disease, even in some cases where perhaps Americans' famous lack of geographic knowledge getting the best of us, where employees may be in a part of the continent that hasn't been affected disease. And, I've spoken with other employment attorneys, both who represent employers and who represent employees. And I'm not alone. Other employment attorneys are hearing of it. Even on the company side, some companies who do business in Africa are having difficulty with employees who don't want to travel to the region, even though that's a part of their normal job duties. So it certainly is something that employment lawyers across the country appear to be seeing.
Wow, I mean, it does make some sense that there is some concern from both employers and employees, but still, that reaction is pretty wild. And then second, when it comes to this fear and this concern for Ebola and workplace-related concerns, what advice can you offer up for both employers and employees? What guidance do you have?
Sure. First and foremost, an understanding that our fear, while the disease is very, very serious, the likelihood of any particular employer having to deal with an employee who's been exposed to the virus is, in time, extremely rare. The likelihood of someone coming into your workplace actually having Ebola is much less likely than you being struck by lightning, for example. So, an understanding that the fear may be disproportionate. Secondly, an understanding on the part of employers that while the issue hasn't been litigated, the Ebola condition likely is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, whether an employee has the disease or whether they're being treated as having the disease by the employer. In both situations, they would likely be covered and protected by the ADA. So it would be unwise for employers to just, as a knee-jerk reaction out of fear, terminate an employee for that. A better approach is one of thought dialogue with the employee and a dialogue that probably brings in that employer's employment law counsel as a even if an employee has been exposed to the disease, it generally runs its course within 2 or 3 weeks. So accommodation of employees is going to be a very easy matter in the case of Ebola, even if an employee was exposed to it. So number one, don't rule the day. And number two, have a dialogue between employers and employees and bring in your employment counsel before making any knee-jerk decisions.
Absolutely, it is quite unlikely that an employer or an employee will have to deal with this type of situation. So it is best to avoid those knee-jerk reactions. Once again, that was Christopher McKinney of the McKinney firm. For more of his insight on this topic and others in the employment law space, be sure to visit TexasEmploymentLawBlog.com. Thank you for joining me today, Chris.
Thank you, sir.